Tyler Morrison's small pink tongue darted out of his mouth for the third time in less than 5 minutes. Each time, it was directed at the expressionless face of Sergeant David Washington, who stood tall in his crisp uniform, motionless and focused. Tyler was only 11 years old, and the boy clearly found the ceremony happening at the Veterans Memorial dreadfully boring. Rocking from one sneaker-clad foot to the other, he tried to draw attention the only way he knew, by mocking. "Dad, look!" Tyler shouted, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "This guy doesn't even blink. I bet he isn't even a real soldier. Probably just some actor they paid to stand here like a statue." Dozens of people turned at the boy's voice. His father, Richard Morrison, the CEO of a billion-dollar tech company, barely looked up. His eyes remained fixed on the glowing screen of his cell phone, answering messages that he clearly thought were more important than the event. His mother, Patricia Morrison, was not much help either. She kept filming everything on her phone for Instagram, adding comments to her story about how dull it was to be stuck at some serious military thing, just because her husband had donated a large sum to the Veterans Foundation. Meanwhile, Sergeant David Washington remained composed. At only 28, David had already completed 3 tours in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq. His chest carried medals of courage and merit, though he wore them with modesty. Today he was not in battle. He was fulfilling a duty of honor, standing guard during a memorial held every first Sunday of the month to pay respect to soldiers who never returned home. But none of that mattered to Tyler. He stepped closer to the rope barrier, his spotless $2,000 designer sneakers sinking slightly into the manicured grass of the memorial lawn. "Hey, soldier!" the boy yelled, drawing gasps from several bystanders. "Can you talk, or do you just stand there like some broken robot?" Some people nearby shook their heads in disgust. A few tourists whispered angrily. An older woman muttered, "Shameful." A veteran seated in a wheelchair clenched his fists in visible frustration. But Tyler only grew bolder. He pulled silly faces, rolled his eyes, and shoved his tongue out again, clearly amused by his own antics. Sergeant Washington's jaw remained steady. He had endured far worse provocations during war. In combat, he had faced enemies whose goal was to kill him, and he had learned never to react recklessly. Yet here, in his own country, while honoring fallen comrades, the insults of a spoiled child felt like a different kind of battlefield. "Tyler, come here now," Patricia finally called, though her voice was weak and half-hearted. She didn't sound like a mother correcting a son, but like someone only half-interested. Her attention was still mostly on her phone, angling it for the perfect clip. The boy ignored her completely. Instead, he locked his eyes on Sergeant Washington, stuck out his tongue one more time, and then shouted something that made the entire memorial freeze. "Hey, chocolate soldier. I bet you can't even fight. Probably just stand there looking pretty for pictures." The world around them went silent. It was the kind of silence that presses on the chest and lingers in the air. Even small children who had been laughing moments before fell quiet. Patricia's phone slipped slightly from her hands. Richard finally glanced up from his screen. The veteran in the wheelchair began to roll forward, his face burning with anger. Still, Sergeant David Washington did not move. His discipline, sharpened over years of service, held him steady. But inside something shifted. It wasn't simple rage. It was heavier, deeper, and far more deliberate. He stood there, calm and unwavering, but his eyes now carried a fire that only those who had seen real battles could recognize. David knew humiliation when he saw it. He also knew disrespect. And while an immature child's taunts couldn't compare to what he had survived overseas, this was different. Here, in front of grieving families, in front of veterans who had buried their friends, he was being degraded, not as a soldier, not as a professional, but as a black man in uniform. The sting of the racist insult echoed across the space like a bomb no one had expected. Some people gasped audibly. Others turned away, unwilling to watch a child behave so disgracefully. But most eyes remained fixed on the boy, horrified. Tyler, however, looked pleased with himself. He turned, waiting for laughs, expecting approval, but instead found rows of disgusted, angry faces staring back. Patricia finally tucked away her phone, but her concern was still more about how this looked than about what her son had said. "Tyler, don't talk like that," she scolded weakly. Talk like what, Mom? The boy shot back with full arrogance. I just told the truth. Look at him. Bet he can't fight. Soldiers today are all soft. Richard Morrison, finally sensing that eyes were now turning toward his family, muttered sharply to his wife. Patricia, control the kid. People are watching. His tone wasn't about right or wrong. It was about embarrassment, about reputation. Through it all, David remained as still as stone. His eyes, though, now followed the boy carefully, like a soldier reading an opponent's every move. Tyler didn't realize it, but the man he was mocking had led life-or-death rescue missions. David had earned 3 medals for valor in combat. He had commanded soldiers who trusted him with their lives. And enemies he fought overseas had shown him more respect than this privileged child. Hey, soldier boy. Tyler continued recklessly, edging closer to the barrier. I'm talking to you. My dad pays your taxes so you work for us. Why don't you get me a soda? The veteran in the wheelchair wheeled closer, his chest covered with medals that gleamed in the sunlight. His voice trembled with fury. Boy, you have no idea who you're talking to. Tyler rolled his eyes, dismissing him. Oh, another boring old man with a lecture. You lost the war anyway, didn't you? What kind of soldiers are you? The air grew heavy with anger, but David still didn't flinch. He let the insults pile up, each one added to a mental ledger. His training had taught him that sometimes the best response was not immediate. Sometimes victory came from waiting, from letting the opponent dig their own hole until they fell straight into it. What no one else noticed was a man in a plain suit standing quietly nearby. His eyes never left the scene. David noticed him. He knew who the man was. A small nod passed between them, barely visible but enough. The man lifted a hand to his lapel and spoke softly into a hidden device. Tyler was still taunting. Tyler was still taunting. I don't want to leave, he told his mother defiantly when she urged him again. I want to see if this fake soldier can make me leave. Bet he doesn't even have the guts to move. He then began mocking David's rigid stance, puffing out his chest and marching around in exaggerated circles, his voice making distorted military noises. Tourists who had been silent before now raised their phones to record, but not in amusement. In outrage. Sergeant Washington stood unshaken, his posture perfect, his focus unbroken. But in his mind, every insult, every face the boy made, every racist word was being catalogued. He wasn't just a soldier on guard duty. He was also trained in military psychology. He knew the power of patience. And more importantly, he knew that this boy, this family, had just made a mistake far bigger than they realized. Because David Washington was not only a decorated combat veteran. He was the son of Colonel James Washington, a senior military advisor in Washington, D.C. His mother, Dr. Angela Washington, was one of the nation's most respected civil rights lawyers. And standing nearby, the man in the suit, the one quietly speaking into his device, was no ordinary bystander. He was an agent. And he had just begun making calls. The Morrison family had no idea, but their Sunday outing was about to spiral far beyond a childish prank. Tyler thought he was mocking a statue. What he had actually done was awaken a force he couldn't possibly understand. The air at the memorial was heavy with tension. Tyler Morrison kept pacing, still smirking, still convinced he was the smartest person in the crowd. His arms crossed, he tilted his head back with the smugness of a boy who had never once faced real consequences in his life. I don't want to leave, he said louder this time, ignoring his mother's weak calls. I want to see if this statue soldier can actually move. He's probably too scared. Just look at him, he's frozen. To make his point, Tyler puffed his chest and imitated the guard's posture, stomping in exaggerated steps like a clownish version of a marching soldier. His high-pitched sounds mocked military commands, drawing gasps from onlookers. A couple of teenagers raised their phones to record. Not because it was funny, but because they couldn't believe the level of disrespect happening right in front of them. Some whispered angrily. Others shook their heads. The veteran in the wheelchair clenched his fists tighter, his knuckles white with pressure. Still, Sergeant David Washington remained steady, unmoving, his gaze fixed straight ahead. Inside, though, David's sharp mind was at work. He wasn't just a soldier with combat experience. He was also a West Point graduate with a degree in psychology. He knew how to assess behavior under stress. He had learned to separate threats from mere noise. Tyler Morrison was noise, a spoiled child protected by wealth and parents who looked the other way. But noise could still become dangerous if ignored too long. Tyler wasn't slowing down. His mocking turned more theatrical. Pretending to faint dramatically, he shouted, "Oh my God, this soldier is scaring me. Mommy, he's staring at me like he's going to attack. Somebody help me." The crowd gasped again. A few mothers pulled their children closer. Patricia Morrison, instead of correcting her son, joined in with a sharp voice. "Excuse me," she shouted toward officers nearby. "That guard is intimidating my son. This is unacceptable. You'll be hearing from our lawyer." Several people booed at her words. Even strangers who had stayed silent up until now turned to glare at her. Everyone could see clearly what was happening. Everyone but the Morrison family. David remained calm. He let every insult pass, every racist word sink into the memory of the crowd. What no one realized was that he wasn't ignoring Tyler. He was recording him, literally. Standard honor guard protocol required soldiers to carry a small recording device during ceremonies to capture disturbances or threats. Every word Tyler had spewed, every slur, was already stored in high-quality audio. The man in the discreet suit finally stepped forward. His movements were calm, professional, precise. He stopped just a few feet from the Morrison family, flashed a badge and spoke evenly. "Agent Johnson, Presidential Protection Service. I need to speak with you about your son's behavior." Richard Morrison finally put down his phone, his face paling at the words Presidential Protection Service. He tried to laugh it off. "That's ridiculous. My son is just a kid fooling around. You're blowing this way out of proportion." Agent Johnson's eyes stayed locked on him. His voice was steady, without a hint of hesitation. "Sir, your son is disrupting an official military ceremony and has used racially discriminatory language against a member of the armed forces. This is considered a disturbance of the peace and potentially a hate crime on federal property." The crowd stirred at the word hate crime. Patricia's mouth fell open. Richard's hands twitched nervously. Tyler, however, only grinned wider. "Hate crime? Against who?" "Him." He pointed at David, still standing tall. "He's just a guard. You can't do anything to me. My dad knows the governor." Laughter bubbled out of the boy, loud and mocking. But this time no one else was laughing. The silence that followed was heavier than before. It wasn't just outrage now, it was the silence of people sensing that something far bigger was about to unfold. For the first time, David allowed the faintest trace of a smile to flicker across his lips. He hadn't moved an inch, but the boy had just crossed the line he had been waiting for. Tyler had spoken directly in front of a federal agent, using explicit racist language. That changed everything. Agent Johnson adjusted his stance. "Young man," he said firmly, "you have just publicly confessed to racially motivated disruption of a federal military ceremony. That changes the situation completely." Patricia jumped in quickly, desperation creeping into her voice. "He's only 11. You can't be serious. He's just a child. This is absurd." "Ma'am," Agent Johnson replied coolly, "racial discrimination is a federal offense regardless of age. And your son's behavior is not childish mischief. It is learned arrogance, rooted in privilege and displayed in public against a decorated officer." At those words, whispers rippled through the crowd. Phones kept recording. The Morrison family, for the first time, seemed to feel the walls closing in. David stayed composed, his body still in formation. But his presence had shifted. He was no longer just enduring insults, he was preparing. His stillness now carried weight, the kind of weight that made everyone realize something decisive was coming. Then an older man pushed his wheelchair forward, metals gleaming on his chest. His voice was sharp but proud. "Agent Johnson, I'm retired Colonel Martinez. I served with Sergeant Washington's father. If you need witnesses to what happened here, I have 15 veterans ready to testify." That declaration drew murmurs of agreement from others in the crowd. Suddenly, the Morrison family wasn't facing just one soldier or one agent. They were facing an entire wall of veterans, families, and civilians united in outrage. But Tyler still didn't understand. He puffed his chest again and shouted, "See, Mom? He still hasn't moved. He's pathetic. If I threw something at him, he wouldn't even react." His words only deepened the anger in the crowd. Some people groaned audibly. Patricia, clearly shaken, tried once more to pull her son back, but her voice lacked conviction. She had lost control long ago. David's sharp eyes scanned the boy, then flicked briefly toward Agent Johnson. That small, nearly invisible exchange was enough. Plans were being set in motion. The Morrison family had no clue, but their son's cruelty had just triggered consequences that would ripple far beyond this Sunday afternoon. And for the first time, a shadow of doubt crossed Tyler's arrogant face. He sensed that maybe, just maybe, he had pushed too far. The quiet at the memorial was no longer ordinary silence. It had turned into something sharper, like the pause before a storm. Families, veterans, and tourists stood frozen, their eyes moving between Tyler Morrison's smug grin and the soldier who had yet to flinch. The disrespect had gone too far and everyone knew it. Tyler, however, still thought he was untouchable. "See, Mom?" he laughed, arms stretched out wide. "He still doesn't do anything. I told you he's just standing here like a doll. What kind of soldier can't even defend himself?" Gasps rolled through the crowd. A mother pulled her young son closer, shielding his ears as if to protect him from the venom dripping from Tyler's words. The veteran in the wheelchair tightened his fists again, his chest rising and falling with rage. David Washington remained still. His hands at his sides, his eyes fixed forward, posture perfect. From the outside he looked unshaken. But behind those steady eyes, his mind worked like a strategist on a battlefield. He wasn't ignoring the insults. He was documenting them. Every word, every sneer, every racial slur. His recording device clipped to his uniform captured it all. The man in the discreet suit, Agent Johnson, spoke again, his voice low but firm. "Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, I strongly advise you to step aside and address your son's behavior immediately." Patricia swallowed, her painted nails trembling slightly as she tried to reach for Tyler's arm. "Tyler, come here. Now." "No," Tyler shouted, jerking away. "I want to see if he can make me move. He's just a fake soldier. Come on, statue, make me leave." His voice, dripping with arrogance, echoed across the stone walls of the memorial. More people began recording, their phones raised high. The story was no longer just a private embarrassment, it was turning into evidence. Agent Johnson spoke into his lapel again, his words too quiet for the crowd to hear, but his body language gave everything away. Reinforcements were being called. And once again David's sharp gaze met his, just for a split second. The two men understood each other without a word. Meanwhile, Tyler puffed out his chest and kept taunting. "Hey, chocolate soldier. My dad pays your salary, so that means you work for us. You should salute me. Or better yet, go grab me a drink." A collective gasp came from the crowd. Several people hissed in anger. One man muttered, "Unbelievable," while another shouted, "Enough." But Tyler only grinned wider. He thought he was winning. The veteran in the wheelchair rolled forward another inch, his voice rising. "Boy, you have no idea who you're talking to. That man has seen more in 1 year than you will in your lifetime. Show some respect." But Tyler dismissed him with a mocking laugh. "Oh please. You all act like these soldiers are heroes. They probably just stand around for pictures. Didn't you lose your wars anyway?" The veteran's face flushed and the crowd groaned loudly. Patricia covered her mouth, horrified, not at her son's words, but at the realization that dozens of phones had caught them on video. David remained still, but the corners of his mouth twitched, not with anger but with a calculated patience. He had learned in war that sometimes silence spoke louder than shouting. Letting the enemy overplay their hand was often the most effective strategy. And Tyler was overplaying his hand. Agent Johnson finally stepped closer. His calm but commanding tone cut through the boy's laughter. "Young man, I need you to stop immediately. Your behavior is being documented, and I must remind you again that this ceremony is federal property. What you are doing is no longer a joke. But Tyler rolled his eyes, muttering just loud enough for everyone to hear, "What's he gonna do? He's just another black guy in a uniform. Can't touch me." The entire memorial froze. The words hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. Patricia's face turned ghostly pale. Richard finally stood from the bench, but his first instinct wasn't to discipline his son. It was to whisper harshly to his wife, "Patricia, control him. People are filming." Too late. The damage had been done. David's eyes flicked toward Agent Johnson once again. This time the agent's jaw tightened. The boy had crossed the last line. Unseen by the Morrison family, Johnson's device relayed the audio directly to a secure channel. And that meant something crucial. Tyler Morrison's words were no longer just a child's mischief. They were now part of an official federal record. At that moment, a ripple went through the crowd. More veterans stepped forward, their medals shining in the sunlight. One by one they moved closer, standing silently in support of David. Their presence created an invisible wall of dignity against the boy's mockery. Tyler, still oblivious, sneered at them. "What? More old men? What are you gonna do? Tell me stories about the good old days. You guys don't scare me." The boy's arrogance only made the silence around him feel heavier. Every face in the crowd looked at him with disgust. And for the first time, the boy's bravado faltered ever so slightly. His laugh came out weaker than before. Then it happened. The vibration of a phone call buzzed through Agent Johnson's device. He pressed it to his ear, his face serious. His responses were short, clipped. "Understood, Colonel." "Yes, sir." "He's safe. We'll proceed as instructed." When he lowered his hand, his entire demeanor had changed. He turned to the Morrison family, his voice carrying even more authority. "Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, I just spoke with Colonel James Washington, military advisor to the Pentagon and father of Sergeant Washington. He is en route, along with Dr. Angela Washington, one of the most respected civil rights attorneys in the country." Richard Morrison's face drained of color. Patricia's lips trembled. They both recognized those names. This was no longer a minor scene with a guard. It was now a matter involving some of the most powerful figures in Washington, D.C. And standing before them, completely still, Sergeant David Washington finally moved. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his head and locked eyes with Tyler Morrison for the first time. The crowd collectively held its breath. When David spoke, his voice was calm, steady, and commanding. "Young Mr. Morrison," he said, each word carrying weight, "you have committed a racially motivated crime against a decorated officer. But more importantly, you have revealed something about yourself that will shape the rest of your life." For the first time, Tyler's smirk slipped. His mouth opened, but no words came out. And the real reckoning was only just beginning. The memorial had gone from a place of solemn honor to a stage of public outrage. Everyone stood locked on the Morrison family, watching in disbelief as an arrogant child insulted a decorated soldier who had given years of his life to serve the nation. The crowd's judgment wasn't silent anymore. It was carved into every disapproving face, every phone held high to record. Tyler Morrison, however, had not yet realized the storm he was creating. His voice, high and sharp, rang out again. "You can't do anything to me. My dad has money. We know important people. You're just a guard standing there pretending to be a hero." His words dripped with the kind of confidence that only comes from never having faced real accountability. But this time, his voice wavered ever so slightly, betraying a flicker of uncertainty. David Washington, still standing in full formation, let the words wash over him. He had endured worse than insults, bullets, explosions, nights without sleep in the desert sands. But there was something more cutting in this child's cruelty. It wasn't just an attack on him. It was a slap in the face to every soldier who had fallen, to every family grieving the empty seats at their dinner tables. And that, David could not allow to go unanswered. Slowly, in a move so subtle that most of the crowd barely noticed, David lifted a small device from the side of his uniform. His voice carried clearly across the gathering. "During my years of service," he said, his tone even, "I learned that people reveal who they really are when they believe there are no consequences." Gasps rippled as the device clicked, and a faint sound played back. Tyler's own voice, mocking, sneering, laced with racist words. Each insult was clear, crisp, undeniable. Patricia let out a muffled cry, her manicured hand flying to her mouth. Richard stepped forward, his face hard but pale, his businessman's instinct already calculating the fallout. David's voice never rose, never trembled. It was calm, professional, like a teacher presenting facts. Every word you said has been recorded on standard military equipment. Everything you thought was a joke is now evidence. The crowd shifted, some gasping, others muttering. Phones zoomed in closer. The Morrison family had officially lost control of the narrative. Patricia tried desperately to intervene, her voice shaky. "Wait, he's just a boy. He didn't mean it. You can't." But David cut her off, still calm. "Ma'am, when someone disrupts a federal military ceremony with racial slurs, it is not a matter of meaning. It is a matter of law." Agent Johnson stepped forward to reinforce the point. Disturbance of a federal ceremony. Racial harassment of a public official. Hate crime under federal jurisdiction. These charges are very real. Richard, desperate, pulled his phone from his pocket. His voice was tense, sharp, commanding. "I'm calling my lawyer right now. This is harassment. You can't treat an American family like this." David's gaze finally shifted, locking on Richard with quiet intensity. "Please call him. But understand this, you are not facing a soldier who stands here powerless. I am a decorated veteran with a degree in psychology from West Point, specializing in social behavior and educational reform for cases of toxic privilege. And I am not alone." The air shifted again. From the crowd emerged two figures moving with purpose. The first was a tall man whose very presence commanded respect. Colonel James Washington, retired but still radiating the authority of decades of military service. Even in civilian clothes, his bearing was unmistakable. Beside him walked a woman in a tailored suit, carrying a leather briefcase. Her eyes were sharp, calculating, and unyielding. Dr. Angela Washington, one of the most respected civil rights lawyers in the country, a woman whose name carried weight in every major courtroom in America. The Morrison family froze. They knew those names. They knew that money and connections would not buy them out of this moment. Colonel Washington stepped forward first, his deep voice carrying through the memorial. "David, I received the situation report. You handled yourself with exemplary composure in the face of systematic provocation." The crowd, almost instinctively, straightened at his words. Dr. Washington followed, her gaze fixed on the Morrison family. Her voice was calm but sharp enough to cut through glass. "Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, I have just reviewed the recording. What your son has done is not mischief. It is a racially motivated public attack on a decorated officer in uniform. This is not going away with money or apologies." Richard's confident mask cracked. His voice faltered for the first time. "Look, we can resolve this civilly. A donation. A settlement. Something." Angela's lips curved into a cold, professional smile. "Mr. Morrison, attempting to buy your way out of a federal hate crime is bribery. You're digging your hole deeper." Patricia turned toward her son, panic finally flooding her features. "Tyler, say you're sorry. Right now." But Tyler's arrogance hadn't yet caught up with reality. His lips trembled, but his words still carried defiance. "I didn't know. I didn't know he was important." The silence that followed was deafening. Even Tyler seemed to recognize the weight of what he had just admitted. David's eyes softened slightly, though his voice remained steady. "That is exactly the problem. You didn't respect me because you thought I wasn't important. Respect should never depend on someone's status. Every human being deserves dignity." The boy's bravado collapsed. Tears welled in his eyes, not of remorse but of fear. For the first time he realized he was cornered. The crowd wasn't laughing with him. They were waiting to see justice. Agent Johnson's phone buzzed again. He answered quickly, his tone shifting to one of reverence. "Yes, Colonel. Understood. We will proceed as instructed." When he turned back to the crowd, his words struck like a gavel. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case has now attracted national interest. Media outlets have been informed. Federal prosecutors are reviewing the evidence. A ripple of shock spread through the memorial. Phones shot higher into the air. People whispered frantically, CNN, Fox, MSNBC. Patricia's face turned white as chalk. No, our faces can't be on television. This will ruin us. Richard, do something. But Richard could only stare, his mouth dry, his mind finally realizing what his wealth couldn't fix. Some mistakes could not be erased. Colonel Washington stepped closer, his gaze stern but not unkind. As a father, I understand the instinct to protect your son. But as a soldier who has served this country, I cannot and will not tolerate racial hatred directed at my own. David finally stepped out of formation, his boots moving slowly, each step deliberate. He stopped directly in front of Tyler, who now looked much smaller than his 11 years. You are still young, David said, his voice low but steady. That means you can still change. But understand this, you will not escape consequences. This time you will face them. And as the first news vans rolled up outside the memorial, the Morrison family understood that their carefully built world of wealth and privilege was crumbling before their eyes. The arrival of the news vans transformed the atmosphere completely. What had started as a small crowd gathered for a solemn ceremony was now the center of national attention. Cameramen rushed forward with heavy equipment, microphones extended, voices shouting questions no one was ready to answer. The Morrison family stood frozen, their polished image unraveling by the second. Patricia frantically tried to shield her face from cameras, pulling down her sunglasses and turning away. Richard, usually confident in boardrooms filled with billion-dollar deals, looked pale and unsteady. Tyler, once brimming with arrogance, clutched at his mother's sleeve, suddenly realizing that the world wasn't laughing with him, it was staring at him in judgment. David Washington stood tall, the embodiment of composure. His posture hadn't faltered once since the beginning. To him this wasn't about revenge or anger. It was about dignity, his own, his fellow soldiers, and the memory of those who couldn't stand there to defend themselves. Agent Johnson stepped forward, raising a hand toward the cameras. His voice carried authority, cutting through the noise. This is now a matter of federal investigation. Please remain behind the barrier. The crowd obeyed, but the questions didn't stop. Reporters shouted over one another. Sergeant Washington, do you have a comment? Mr. Morrison, how do you respond to accusations of racism? Is this being treated as a hate crime? Patricia trembled, whispering to Richard through clenched teeth. We need to get out of here. Now. Richard shook his head slowly, his eyes darting between Colonel James Washington, Dr. Angela Washington, and Agent Johnson. It's too late. We're already trapped in this. Colonel Washington, tall and commanding, approached closer, his presence silencing even some reporters. His voice was steady, strong, the kind of voice that came from decades of service. Young man, he said looking at Tyler, you chose to target my son because of the color of his skin. My son who risked his life for this nation. My son who led missions that saved dozens of Americans. My son who graduated with honors and has stood in front of enemies more dangerous than you can imagine. Tyler's lower lip quivered. For the first time, his tears weren't just from fear of being caught. They were the tears of a child slowly realizing the weight of his actions. I didn't know, Tyler muttered through sobs. I didn't know he was important. Gasps rippled through the crowd again. Even reporters lowered their cameras for a moment, stunned at the bluntness of his words. David stepped closer, his expression calm but resolute. And that, he said softly, is the problem. You thought respect only belonged to people who were important. Respect is not about rank, status, or wealth. Every person deserves it. You didn't insult me alone. You insulted every soldier, every veteran, every family who has given to this country. Patricia tried to wrap her arms around her son, shielding him from the stares and flashing cameras. Please, she begged, her voice cracking. He's just a child. He can't handle this. He didn't mean it. Dr. Angela Washington stepped forward now, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. Her voice was calm, professional, but carried a razor edge. Mrs. Morrison, I have fought cases of racial discrimination across this country for years. Do you know what I've learned? Children do not invent prejudice. They are taught it. Whether through words, silence, or entitlement, they learn from their environment. Your son's behavior is not innocent, it's the reflection of lessons he has absorbed. Patricia froze, her eyes dropping to the ground. For once she had no response. Richard's voice cracked with desperation. Look, we'll cooperate. There has to be another way. A settlement. A private resolution. Anything but this circus. Angela's eyes narrowed. Mr. Morrison, this isn't a business deal. This is a federal hate crime. Trying to buy your way out will only add charges to your record. This will not be swept under a rug. Not today. Not ever. Agent Johnson lifted his phone again, speaking into his device. Yes, sir. Understood. When he looked back, his voice carried finality. The Department of Justice has already been informed. The recordings are being reviewed. The evidence is undeniable. The crowd buzzed. Reporters whispered into cameras. The story had already leapt from whispers to headlines. Tyler, shaking now, looked up at David through tear-streaked eyes. His voice was small, broken. I'm sorry. David looked at him, his jaw set. Sorry is the beginning, not the end. Change doesn't come from words, it comes from choices, from actions. Colonel Washington nodded firmly beside his son. There will be consequences. You will learn that words have power, and that hate carries a price. Tyler buried his face in his mother's shoulder, sobbing. But there was no hiding from the cameras, from the crowd, from the truth that had been laid bare. And as the flashing lights of reporters illuminated the Morrison family, the reality settled over them like a crushing weight. Their wealth, their influence, their privilege, all of it had finally failed them. This was no longer a private embarrassment. It was a national reckoning. The flashing lights of news cameras lit up the memorial like a stage. Reporters swarmed the scene, capturing every glance, every movement, every trembling word. The Morrison family, once shielded by wealth and power, now stood exposed in front of an audience that extended far beyond the stone walls of the Veterans Memorial. By nightfall, their faces would be plastered across televisions, phones, and news feeds across the country. Richard Morrison tried to compose himself, smoothing his expensive suit jacket as though appearance alone could restore control. Patricia clutched Tyler protectively, shielding him from the cameras, her manicured hands shaking. Tyler's defiance had finally collapsed, replaced with tears and the fragile whimpering of a boy who had stepped too far and couldn't find his way back. David Washington stood unshaken. The dignity in his posture contrasted sharply with the chaos unfolding before him. His expression was calm, his uniform immaculate, his presence commanding respect without a single word. For the people watching, both at the memorial and soon across the nation, he had become the embodiment of silent strength. Agent Johnson raised a hand toward the crowd. Step back, please. This is now an active federal matter. His voice was steady, the kind of tone that didn't invite argument. The reporters obeyed, though their cameras continued to roll, capturing every second of the unfolding drama. Richard leaned toward Patricia, whispering through clenched teeth. We need to fix this before it destroys everything. His voice was urgent, panicked, far from the confident tone of the CEO who usually commanded boardrooms. Colonel James Washington stepped forward then, his presence pulling the attention of everyone around him. Even without a uniform, his bearing left no question of who he was. A leader, a soldier, a man used to being obeyed. His deep voice carried over the gathering. Mr. Morrison, your family has humiliated my son, insulted every veteran present, and dishonored this sacred ground. And you think you can fix it with lawyers and donations? No, not this time. Patricia tried to speak, her voice trembling. Colonel, please, he's only 11. But Dr. Angela Washington cut her off sharply. Her words were precise, her tone firm but unyielding. Mrs. Morrison, do not use his age as a shield. Your son's behavior was not innocent. It was hateful. Hate, whether from an 11-year-old or an adult, has consequences. And this time he will face them. The crowd murmured in agreement. A veteran spoke from the back. About time. Another nodded firmly. Privilege can't protect him now. Tyler buried his face deeper into his mother's shoulder, tears staining her designer blouse. For once, Patricia didn't care about the fabric or the cameras, she cared only about shielding her son from the judgment pressing in from all sides. But David wasn't finished. For the first time since the insults began, he stepped out fully from his position in the guard. The movement was slow, deliberate, and powerful. The crowd hushed, sensing the weight of what was about to happen. He stood just a few feet from Tyler, his towering figure a sharp contrast to the small boy trembling in his mother's arms. "Tyler," David said, his voice calm but commanding, "you thought you could humiliate me, that your words would strip me of dignity. But dignity isn't yours to take. It belongs to me. To every soldier who has stood where I stand. To every family who has buried someone because they wore this uniform." Tyler sniffled, his voice cracking. I didn't know." David's eyes narrowed slightly. "You didn't know because you never had to. You've lived in a world where no one has told you no, where your parents' money covered your mistakes. But today you will learn something that will follow you the rest of your life. Respect is not optional. It is owed to every human being." The boy sobbed harder, his arrogance shattered. Dr. Washington, standing firmly beside her son, lifted her briefcase. "Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, I have already forwarded the recording to federal prosecutors. You will be contacted formally. The evidence is irrefutable." Patricia let out a sharp cry. "No, please, our family name, our business, this will ruin us." Angela's gaze was steady, cutting through Patricia's desperation. "Then consider this the price of ignoring the values you should have taught your son long ago." Richard tried one last gambit, his voice breaking. "We'll make it right. Donations, community service, anything you want. Just not the courts. Not the media." Colonel Washington's voice cut him down instantly. "This isn't a negotiation. This is accountability. For too long, men like you have thought money buys freedom from consequences. But here on this ground, among these veterans, money means nothing." The words landed like a hammer. The crowd murmured again, phones raised higher. Reporters whispered into microphones, narrating every moment. David leaned closer to Tyler, his voice softening, almost fatherly. "You are still young enough to change. You can grow from this. But that choice will not be bought for you. It will be earned." The boy's sobs quieted, his eyes wide as he stared at the soldier who refused to break under his cruelty. For the first time in his short life, Tyler Morrison looked not at a man he thought he could mock, but at someone he admired, someone he feared, someone who represented something bigger than him. Agent Johnson's phone buzzed again. He lifted it quickly, listening intently. When he lowered it, his announcement carried finality. "The national media has arrived. This story is now a matter of public record. CNN, MSNBC, Fox, they're all here. And federal authorities are watching." Richard swayed slightly where he stood, the weight of those words crashing down on him. His billion-dollar empire, his carefully constructed image, his family's reputation. It was all unraveling in real time. Patricia whispered desperately to her husband. "Richard, do something. Stop this." But Richard had no moves left to play. His voice was hollow, defeated. "It's over." David, standing firm, looked at the boy one last time. "You tried to shame me today, Tyler. But what happened is bigger than you and me. Today you showed this entire nation the danger of unchecked privilege. And today you will begin to learn the meaning of respect." The crowd erupted in quiet applause, not loud but steady, like the sound of rain beginning to fall. Veterans nodded, families held their children tighter, strangers exchanged solemn looks. For the Morrison family, the world they knew had ended. For David Washington, a new chapter had just begun. By now, the Veterans Memorial no longer felt like a quiet place of honor. It had become the focal point of a national scandal. Dozens of cameras surrounded the Morrison family, their lenses capturing every tear, every tremble, every attempt to explain away the damage. Within hours, those images would be everywhere, from television screens in living rooms to trending posts on social media feeds. Patricia tried to shield her face with her hand, but the cameras weren't forgiving. Her voice was shrill with panic. "Please stop filming. This is a misunderstanding. My son didn't mean it." The reporters ignored her, hungry for every detail. "Mrs. Morrison, do you deny your son's comments? Mr. Morrison, is your company prepared to respond to this scandal?" Sergeant Washington, how do you feel about being targeted? Richard, always the powerful CEO in control of conversations, stood frozen. For once he had no answers. His boardroom strategies couldn't silence reporters, couldn't erase videos, couldn't undo the words his son had shouted. Colonel James Washington and Dr. Angela Washington stood nearby, their presence like an immovable wall. Where the Morrisons squirmed under the lights, the Washington family stood tall, unflinching, certain in their cause. Angela's calm, precise voice cut through the chaos. This incident is not just about one child. It is about the environment that allowed him to believe such behavior was acceptable. Privilege without accountability breeds disrespect. And disrespect unchecked breeds hatred. That is why this will not simply vanish. The crowd erupted with murmurs of agreement. Veterans nodded. Parents clutched their children's hands, silently teaching them with looks alone. Tyler, crumbling under the weight of the attention, sobbed into his mother's arms. His earlier arrogance had completely collapsed. His voice shook with fear. I didn't know it was wrong. I didn't know it mattered. David Washington, who had remained steady throughout, finally stepped closer once again. He looked down at the boy with an expression that mixed sternness with a trace of pity. His voice was steady, carrying authority without cruelty. Tyler, ignorance is never an excuse. Every word you said today you chose. You thought being young or privileged would protect you. But today you learned the truth, actions have consequences. The boy hiccuped through tears, looking at David with wide, terrified eyes. Colonel Washington placed a firm hand on his son's shoulder, speaking with the weight of a man who had led soldiers through war. David, you've shown restraint beyond measure today. You've taught not just this boy but everyone watching what dignity looks like under fire. The crowd applauded, some quietly, others with firm claps that echoed against the stone memorial. Patricia's voice broke through the noise, desperate, pleading. Please don't destroy us. He's just a child. We'll do anything to make this right. Angela Washington's sharp gaze turned to her. Mrs. Morrison, you don't seem to understand. This isn't about what you're willing to give. It's about what your son must learn. Justice is not for sale. Richard stepped forward then, finally dropping the CEO mask. His voice cracked as he spoke. Please, I'm begging you. This will ruin us. My company, my reputation, our lives. Colonel Washington's eyes hardened. Perhaps then you'll understand what it feels like for lives to be ruined not by choice, but by the cruelty of others. My family has fought against injustice for generations. We know what it costs. Now it is time you learned. The cameras clicked wildly, capturing every word, every strained expression. Then Agent Johnson's phone buzzed once more. He answered briskly, his face shifting as he listened. When he lowered it, his words struck like thunder. The Department of Justice has officially confirmed. This will be investigated as a federal hate crime. The footage, recordings, and witness statements are already in their possession. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some cheered. Others muttered, good. About time. Patricia nearly collapsed, clutching Tyler tighter. No. Please, not federal court. Not charges. He's just a boy. Angela's response was sharp, unflinching. Then let this be the day he stops being just a boy and starts learning what it means to be accountable. David's steady voice followed, directed squarely at Tyler. You wanted to test me today. You wanted to see if I would break. I didn't. But today you broke. And from that brokenness you have a choice, stay the same or rebuild into something better. Tyler's sobs quieted as he listened. For the first time, the boy's eyes weren't filled with arrogance or bravado. They were filled with something new. Fear mixed with the first flicker of understanding. The crowd erupted again as more media crews arrived, rushing to capture the scene. Helicopters circled overhead. The Morrison family was surrounded on all sides, not just by cameras, but by the weight of a nation that would not look away. Richard whispered harshly to his wife. We need to get out of here. But Patricia shook her head. Her voice cracked, tears spilling down her cheeks. There's no way out anymore. We're trapped. And she was right. For the Morrison family, the world they once controlled with money and influence was gone. For David Washington, however, this moment wasn't just about one spoiled boy. It was about sending a message that would echo far beyond the memorial grounds. Dignity cannot be mocked, respect cannot be bought, and justice, true justice, always finds a way forward. The crowd had grown larger, the air thick with tension and anticipation. The Veterans Memorial, usually a quiet sanctuary of honor, now pulsed with the energy of a story that was already racing across the country. Reporters shouted over each other, microphones thrust forward, camera lights flashing relentlessly. The Morrison family stood at the center of it all, Patricia trembling, Richard's face pale with dread, and Tyler clinging to his mother's arm, his sobs echoing louder than the clicking shutters of cameras. Only hours earlier, they had walked into this place with confidence and wealth shielding them like armor. Now they stood stripped of it all, cornered by truth and consequence. David Washington remained unwavering. His uniform still immaculate, his posture unbroken, he looked every bit the soldier he was, calm in the storm, dignified in the face of humiliation. The crowd's eyes followed him with respect, their murmurs carrying words like hero and strength. Agent Johnson's voice cut through the chaos. "Ladies and gentlemen, this matter is now under federal review. I need everyone to step back." His tone carried a weight that silenced even the reporters for a moment. Still, the cameras rolled, documenting everything as history unfolded. Colonel James Washington stood tall beside his son, his presence alone commanding attention. What we have witnessed today is not just a child misbehaving. It is the reflection of values unchecked. A boy raised to believe his words carry no weight, his actions no consequence. But today proves otherwise. The crowd clapped, some softly, others with the determination of people who had seen enough arrogance in their lives. Tyler hiccuped through his tears, his earlier arrogance long gone. "I didn't mean it," he whispered, his voice small, broken. "I didn't know it was so bad." David's gaze fixed on him, stern but not cruel. "You thought it was funny to strip someone of dignity. But respect isn't a game. It's not earned only by medals or money. It is owed to every human being. Today you disrespected me, but you also disrespected every soldier and every family who has lost someone in service to this nation." Patricia's face twisted with desperation as she pulled her son closer. "Please. He's just a child. He didn't understand." Dr. Angela Washington stepped forward, her voice clear and sharp, cutting through Patricia's pleas. "No, Mrs. Morrison. Children absorb the lessons of their home. The entitlement, the arrogance, the belief that money excuses cruelty, these are not accidents. Your son is not too young to understand right from wrong. He is simply unaccustomed to being held accountable." Her words landed heavily. The crowd murmured in agreement, their heads nodding, their eyes fixed on the broken family in front of them. Richard tried again, his voice cracked, stripped of its usual confidence. "Look, we'll cooperate. We'll do whatever it takes. Just, not this. Not federal charges. This will destroy us." Angela's reply was unflinching. "Mr. Morrison, this is not about saving your family's image. It is about teaching your son, and the nation watching, that hate has consequences. You cannot buy your way out this time." Agent Johnson lifted his phone again, speaking quickly into his device. When he lowered it, his face was firm. "The Department of Justice has confirmed. The investigation is already underway. Evidence from the recordings, from the crowd, from the live broadcasts, it is all being secured." The crowd buzzed louder, some gasping, others clapping at the announcement. Reporters spoke rapidly into cameras, their voices carrying words like hate crime, federal charges, and justice. Patricia nearly collapsed, gripping Tyler as though she could shield him from the tidal wave coming their way. "Please, please, he's only 11. David stepped closer, his eyes steady on the boy. His voice softened, but the weight of his words carried further than any shout could. "You are 11. That means you can still change. But change only comes when you face truth, not when you run from it. Today is the beginning of your lesson." The boy stared up at him through swollen eyes, silent now, absorbing the words that cut deeper than any punishment his parents had ever given. Colonel Washington turned his gaze to Richard and Patricia. "Your son is not the only one learning today. You two are as well. He didn't grow this arrogance on his own. He was taught, by indulgence, by silence, by example. And now the world sees the result." Richard bowed his head, his shoulders sagging. Patricia wiped at her tears, but the mascara streaks on her face betrayed her collapse. They had built their lives on wealth, status, and control. None of it mattered here. Not against the weight of truth. And as the crowd erupted once more, some clapping, some chanting in support of David, it became clear that this was no longer about one soldier and one child. It was about something larger, something that resonated with every person watching. Respect, dignity, accountability. Three things the Morrison family had spent years avoiding had now come crashing down upon them in one unforgettable afternoon. David Washington looked at Tyler one last time before turning back to his position. Remember this day. It will follow you. What you do with it, that is up to you. The boy nodded weakly, his tears silent now, his bravado gone. For the first time in his young life, he had been stripped of the shield of privilege. And in its place stood a lesson he would never escape. The crowd continued to buzz, news outlets broadcast live, and across the nation people watched the moment unfold. Some with anger, some with satisfaction, and many with the hope that maybe, just maybe, something good could come out of this painful humiliation. For the Morrison family, it was the most expensive lesson they would ever learn. For David Washington, it was proof that dignity could never be destroyed by hate. It could only be made stronger. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the memorial as the crowd grew thicker. The hum of helicopters overhead blended with the chatter of reporters, the whirring of cameras, and the restless murmurs of onlookers. What had begun as a solemn military ceremony had now transformed into a national spectacle, one that no amount of wealth or influence could control. The Morrison family stood in the middle of it all, looking nothing like the polished, untouchable figures they had been that morning. Patricia's designer outfit was smeared with streaks of makeup from her tears. Richard's tie hung loose, his face pale and drawn, his hands twitching nervously. And Tyler, once the arrogant child mocking a soldier, now clung to his mother's side, trembling with fear, his earlier bravado completely shattered. David Washington, however, remained as solid as stone. He had endured every insult, every cruel word, and had responded not with anger but with unwavering discipline. Now, with the world watching, his presence carried more power than any outburst could. Agent Johnson's voice rang out again, commanding order. Everyone remain calm. This situation is being handled at the highest level. Federal authorities are already involved. The reporters surged forward, voices overlapping. Sergeant Washington, how do you feel about the insults directed at you? Mr. Morrison, will your company respond to these allegations? Mrs. Morrison, do you regret your son's behavior? Patricia tried desperately to shield her son from the microphones, her voice cracking. Please leave him alone. He's just a boy. He didn't mean any harm. But the crowd was no longer sympathetic. A veteran in the front row shouted, My son was 19 when he died in combat. Don't tell me 11 is too young to know respect. Others nodded, their faces etched with years of sacrifice and pain. Colonel James Washington stepped forward again, his voice strong and steady. Respect is not something children are too young to learn. It should be taught from the very beginning. And when it is not, we all see the results. The crowd clapped loudly, the sound echoing across the memorial grounds. Tyler's small voice broke through the noise, barely audible. I didn't know. I didn't know he was important. David finally turned toward the boy, his eyes steady, his tone firm but calm. And that is exactly the lesson you must learn. Respect isn't given only to those you think are important. Every person, no matter their status, deserves it. Today you revealed the dangerous belief that only some lives matter. That belief ends here. The boy's lip quivered, his eyes wet. He looked down at the ground, unable to meet David's gaze. Dr. Angela Washington spoke then, her words precise and cutting. This isn't just about a boy's bad behavior. It's about what he was allowed to believe. That money protects him. That disrespect has no cost. That arrogance is power. But power without respect is nothing. Today he faces a consequence long overdue. Richard finally stepped forward, his voice shaky. Please, there must be a way to settle this. Quietly. Privately. We'll make a donation. We'll apologize publicly. Anything. Angela shook her head firmly. No, Mr. Morrison. This is not a matter of negotiation. This is a federal crime. Trying to bite your way out will only add to your disgrace. Patricia sobbed openly, clutching Tyler tighter. Please, he's my baby. He can't go through this. Colonel Washington's voice rose once again, heavy with finality. Your son mocked a decorated soldier. He insulted every veteran here. And he used hatred to do it. Actions have consequences. That is the lesson he will learn today. The crowd cheered in agreement, some clapping, others shouting words of support for David. Reporters captured every second, their broadcasts already spreading across the nation. David's eyes softened slightly as he looked down at Tyler. You wanted to see if I would move, if I would break. I didn't. But today you did. And from this moment forward, you will remember what respect truly means. Agent Johnson's phone buzzed once more. He answered swiftly, nodding as he listened. When he hung up, his voice carried across the memorial. The president has been briefed. This incident is now considered a matter of national interest. Federal prosecutors will take the lead. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Patricia nearly collapsed, her sobs uncontrollable. Richard's face drained of all color. Their wealth, their influence, their power, it was all meaningless against the weight of national attention. David stepped back, resuming his posture, his face calm, his stance perfect. To the crowd, he was no longer just a soldier standing guard. He was a symbol of dignity, of honor, of resilience against hate. Tyler wiped his tears with his sleeve, his voice trembling. I'm sorry. David looked at him, his expression unchanging. Sorry is where it starts. But true change takes more than words. It takes work. It takes humility. It takes courage. The boy nodded slowly, too shaken to argue, too broken to resist. The crowd continued to cheer, their voices rising in unison. Reporters shouted updates into cameras. Across the nation, millions were already watching, their hearts stirred by the sight of a soldier who stood firm against hatred and a privileged family finally facing consequences. For the Morrison family, it was the most devastating day of their lives. For David Washington, it was proof that dignity could not be shaken by insults. It could only grow stronger when tested. And as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, the world understood that what had begun as a child's cruel taunt had become a turning point, a moment that would echo long after the cameras stopped rolling. 6 months later, the Veterans Memorial looked different. The air still carried the same quiet dignity, but today the crowd was larger than ever. Flags rippled in the breeze, rows of veterans sat proudly in their uniforms, and families gathered to honor the sacrifices of those who had served. But this time, the focus wasn't only on the fallen, it was also on a story that had captured the nation. At the podium stood Major David Washington. No longer just a sergeant in the honor guard, his promotion reflected not only his military record but the moral strength he had displayed on that unforgettable day. His uniform shone, his medals gleamed, but it was his voice, steady, clear and dignified, that held the thousands in attendance spellbound. 6 months ago, David began, an 11-year-old boy tested me in a way I never expected. I faced combat. I faced enemies who wanted to end my life. But that day I faced something different, ignorance, arrogance and hate, right here at home. The crowd listened silently, every eye fixed on him. David continued. In that moment, I realized the most important battles aren't always fought on foreign soil. Some of the hardest battles are fought here, against prejudice, against disrespect, against the false belief that privilege excuses cruelty. That day taught me that the fight for dignity is never over, it lives in every interaction, in every choice we make. Applause rippled through the crowd, soft at first, then louder, swelling like a wave. Far from the stage, seated quietly in the audience, was Tyler Morrison. He looked nothing like the arrogant boy who had once sneered at a soldier. Dressed plainly, his head slightly bowed, he sat beside a counselor. His parents were nowhere near the spotlight. Their family had been forced into silence after their reputation collapsed under the weight of national outrage. The past 6 months had been the most difficult of Tyler's life. The story had gone viral, reaching every corner of the country and even beyond. His family had lost millions when investors abandoned Richard's company, unwilling to be tied to scandal. Patricia's once glittering social circle evaporated overnight. And Tyler himself had been placed into an intensive re-education program, working with veterans, volunteering at hospitals, learning firsthand what real sacrifice meant. For the first time in his privileged life, Tyler was facing consequences no amount of money could erase. David paused at the podium, then lifted a piece of paper. "Today I want to share something with you. A letter I received from that boy." The crowd leaned in, the air heavy with anticipation. David unfolded the letter and began to read. "Sergeant Washington," he said, his voice carrying the words, "I don't know if I deserve your forgiveness, but I want you to know I understand now. What I said to you that day wasn't just about you, it was about every soldier who has ever served. It was about every person I disrespected without realizing it. I have spent the last months learning about real courage, real sacrifice, and real respect. Heroes aren't people with money or status. Heroes are people like you who stand for others even when it costs them. I'm sorry for what I did. I'm trying to change." The crowd was silent, moved by the words of a boy who had once embodied arrogance but was now learning humility. David folded the letter carefully. "This letter reminded me that our greatest victories are not found in defeating enemies, but in helping people become allies. Hate can turn to understanding. Arrogance can turn to humility. Change is possible, if we demand it, if we teach it, and if we live it." The applause that followed shook the memorial. Veterans clapped firmly, families rose to their feet, and the crowd's cheers carried far beyond the stone walls. As the ceremony ended, Tyler stood slowly, his hands shaking. He walked hesitantly toward the stage, each step heavy with the weight of his past. David watched him approach, his face calm, his eyes steady. When Tyler reached him, he spoke in a trembling voice. "Sergeant Washington, thank you. Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I didn't deserve another chance." David's stern expression softened into a rare smile. He extended his hand. "Tyler, you've proven that no one is a lost cause if they're willing to put in the work to change. I'm proud of you." The boy's small hand gripped the soldier's firmly. The handshake symbolized more than forgiveness. It was proof of growth, of redemption, of the power of accountability to transform lives. Today, David Washington served not only as a decorated soldier but also as a national consultant on military diversity programs. His story had inspired thousands to enlist, millions to confront prejudice with dignity, and countless young people to rethink what true respect meant. And Tyler Morrison, once a symbol of unchecked privilege, now spent his weekends volunteering at veteran centers, helping wounded soldiers, and speaking at schools about the dangers of entitlement and arrogance. His family had learned a painful truth, that real value was not measured in money, but in the respect earned by doing what was right. The legacy of that one day at the memorial was not humiliation, but transformation. David Washington's greatest victory wasn't standing unshaken in the face of insult. It was helping turn a prejudiced boy into a young man dedicated to fighting the very hatred that once defined him. As the crowd dispersed, the message of the day lingered in every heart. True strength is not about power or wealth. True strength lies in honor, in dignity, and in the courage to transform ignorance into understanding. And that day, both David Washington and Tyler Morrison proved that even the ugliest moments can become powerful lessons. Lessons that echo far beyond the place where they began.